Shadow Slave. Chapter 2211 Wielders of Power. A cold wind blew across the sweltering expanse of Godgrave, making the soldiers shiver. As Ki Song looked at Anvil with a faint smile, the Legion of the Dead stirred. A vast breach opened in their silent wall as numerous puppets moved, clearing a path directly to the battle formation of the Song army. However, that path did not stay open for long. A moment later, the air trembled, and was split apart as a vertical fracture cut the world. Then, it expanded, and for the first time in thousands of years, snow fell on the scorching surface of the ancient bone. As the Dream Gate opened, a raging snowstorm became visible in its towering fissure. A magnificent black palace could be vaguely seen in the billowing snow, as well as the mountain it stood upon. The clouds of snow that escaped the Dream Gate instantly melted, the water boiling and evaporating as a searing haze obscured the front rows of the Song soldiers. Anvil observed the scene calmly. Curious, how are you able to anchor the Dream Gate in the same realm it is rooted to? Ki Song shrugged gracefully. It is a component of the Night Garden. Why, you did not know? There was a subtle mocking note in her, but he did not react. The Night Garden, makes sense. Storm God is the god of guidance and travel, after all, and that ship was made to sail the darkness of her sea. His gaze shifted from the towering rift in reality to Ki Song. Was that the reason why you fed the House of Night to that abomination? She lingered with the answer, then chuckled. I hoped you would show at least a little trepidation, old friend. But you are too far gone, aren't you? What will it take to make you flinch? Ki Song shook her head. I took the Night Garden. I took the other citadels of the Stormsia, too. Rivergate is gone, and Bastion has fallen. My kingdom is stronger than ever before, while you don't even have enough saints to rule yours. Can you feel it, Vale? Can you feel your domain crumbling? Anvil remained silent for a few moments, looking at her impassively. Why should I care? Then, however, his expression changed subtly. Ki Song's smile disappeared, replaced by a cold and vicious expression. Can you feel it now? He looked down, at the bone surface beneath their feet, as if trying to pierce it with his gaze. His eyes darkened slightly, expressing a hint of contempt. I see, you've taken the Spine Ocean, after all. The men I sent to kill your daughters are dying, they are dead. And the citadels they ruled are now without a master. Ki Song looked at him silently with no particular expression, and for a moment, she looked like what she was, a flawlessly preserved, masterfully controlled corpse. Anvil met her gaze calmly. How useless. Do you feel confident now that you have amassed all that power, Song? The beautiful corpse smiled. It does feel nice. He shook his head. That has always been your blind spot. From our days at the academy until now, you have always been controlled by your sense of inferiority, and you have always pursued power to spare yourself from feeling inferior. It would have been amusing if it wasn't so pitiful, banal, and distasteful. But then again, what else would one expect from someone of your breed? Anvil looked at her coldly. Someone like you, who was born with nothing, can't really understand the meaning of power. Power has its uses, sure, but at the end of the day, power itself is meaningless. It is the person who wields it that matters. So why should I flinch? You can take the citadels of the Stormsia, Song. You can destroy Rivergate. You can even slaughter my saints, but it won't matter. Because at the end of the day, you will still have to face me. He regarded her with a hint of disdain. And I am superior. I was forged from purer steel, and no matter how much power you gain, we will never be equals. Ki Song laughed quietly. She fell silent for a few moments, then faced him with melancholy in her eyes. And only someone like you can really think that I was born with nothing. As the cold winds of Ravenheart blew across the sweltering expanse of Godgrave, she took a deep breath and then looked up, at the merciless gray sky. Were you forged from purer steel than broken sword, too? A shadow ran across Anvil's face. He answered evenly. Naturally. Ki Song smiled. Is that why you had to make a deal with the Dreamspawn? I guess your steel was not pure enough to defeat someone, of his breed, yourself. Anvil answered her smile with a cold one of his own. You make it sound as if you weren't there, killing him with me. Why, do you regret it now? Do you wish you made a different choice? She shook her head slowly. No. You and I both know that it was necessary. Just like erasing all traces of a mortal flame was necessary. If someone seems to be having regrets, it's you, Vale. Otherwise, you would not have allowed his daughter to grow into someone neither of us can easily eliminate. Qi Song looked at him calmly. I'll correct your mistake after you die, though. Don't worry. As she said those words, a subtle smell of iron suddenly permeated the air, and Anvil's oppressive presence grew much deeper and terrifyingly sharp, as if it had finally awoken after slumbering all this time. He shook his head. For someone who supposedly had nothing to say, you sure talked a lot. Enough. Let us solve this once and for all. Let us see who is worthy of wearing the crown. Lowering her head for a moment, Qi Song smiled. Farewell, Vale. Anvil summoned his helmet, and his voice rustled in the wind like the clamor of a myriad of blades. Farewell to you, too, Song. A hurricane of scarlet sparks drowned the world. Chapter 2212 Battle Royale. Far away from the sweltering heat of Godgrave, high in the frigid cold of Ravenheart, a magnificent black palace was shrouded by the veil of a raging snowstorm. As the winds howled, a low and reverberating sound echoed in the snow, making the people in the city across the great bridge freeze and turn their heads. There was the groan of stone, and then, the towering main gates of the Black Palace opened wide for the first time in countless years. Beyond the gates nestled deep, dreadful darkness. A moment later, grotesque shapes emerged from the darkness and entered into the light, moving indifferently through the lethal cold of the snowstorm. A vast, seemingly endless river of marching dead was flowing out of the Black Palace, across the stone bridge, and into the towering fissure of the Dream Gate. There were nightmare creatures of all shapes and forms in that river, as well as countless humans. The puppets differed from each other in shape, in size, but a few of them were far more terrifying than all the rest. Those were the puppets made from the corpses of slain titans. As the hurricane of scarlet sparks was giving birth to a vast storm of swords, the first of the titans passed through the Dream Gate, stepping onto the surface of the dead god's breastbone. The world quaked under its footsteps. The dead that stood in front of the sword army had seemed like a legion, but now that the icy halls of Ravenheart opened, their numbers suddenly looked paltry and insignificant. The soldiers of both armies watched in stunned silence as the endless procession of the queen's puppets marched from the billowing snow, the flow of them never ceasing until an entire army of the dead flooded the bone plain, all of them staring at the boundless clouds of swords with eerie, empty gazes. The titans towered above them like grotesque mountains of flesh, some of them so gargantuan that they had barely squeezed through the immense fissure of the Dream Gate. The sea of puppets faced the storm of swords, with two sovereigns facing each other in the middle. It was then that the soldiers of the two great armies finally realized what it meant, and what was about to happen. The two gods of humanity were going to clash, and fight each other until one of them was dead. Some soldiers shuddered from relief, realizing that they would not enter battle today. Others simply looked at the astonishing scene in silent awe. More still were terrified, knowing that mortals like them were not fit to see gods fight. The battles of Transcendent had already threatened to reap their lives as collateral damage. What kind of calamity would be unleashed when Supremes clashed? Somewhere in the battle formation of the Song army, Revel and Moonveil suddenly appeared out of thin air, carried to Godgrave by one of the Song's saints after returning to the waking world from the darkness of the Spine Ocean. Both were bloodied and battered, Revel especially, her mangled body covered in countless wounds. As someone ran to bring the healers, she fell to one knee and looked up with a pale face. Her eyes widened. The corpses of the four sword saints they had brought with them moved, rising from the ground to join the army of the dead. Across the sea of the puppets and the storm of swords, in the formation of the sword army, Summer Night appeared in a similar fashion. His body was in a better state than those of the queen's daughters, but his gaze was bleak and dark, devoid of its usual shine. He looked at the battlefield silently, then lowered his gaze, lingered for a few long moments, and then summoned his armor and his weapons. Almost at the same time, 7 dreadful swords fell from the sky, stopping to hover behind Anvil. He raised an arm, and one of them landed into his hand. The world itself seemed to shift, as if being bent and torn by the eerie gray blade. Qi Song looked at the terrifying sword calmly. I see you are still a consummate collector. A sacred blade, is it? Anvil lowered his head, the vermilion plume of his helmet moving slightly. His indifferent voice sounded even as he answered, aiming the sword at the unarmed queen. It's still a disappointment, but it will do. At least I'm not in the habit of playing with dead dolls. Qi Song laughed, her voice drowning in the rustle of countless swords. I have some living dolls, as well. With that, Her smile dimmed, replaced by a cold and dark expression. Fearsome, predatory crimson flames ignited in her eyes. These toys won't save you. A moment later, she was suddenly in front of Anvil. Her bare hand crashed into his breastplate, denting it. Her fingers left deep grooves on the enchanted metal, almost tearing through it. The force of her blow was fearsome enough to produce a devastating shockwave, pushing the King of Swords a couple steps back. At the same time, the sea of puppets surged forward like a tide. The storm of swords had blotted out the radiant gray sky, casting a deep shadow on the battlefield. Now, the swords plummeted from the height, as if the sky itself was falling on the dead army. The flying swords shone as they fell, reflecting the blinding light, and for a moment, it seemed as if the entire world was aflame. When the cloud of steel collided with the tide of the dead, the burning world seemed to shatter. The power of the impacts was so immense that they produced blinding flashes of light and waves of unbearable heat. Some of the puppets were torn apart, while some were severely damaged. However, more still dodged or deflected the flying swords, moving with the cold and calculated skill of sublime warriors. A skill like that was a harrowing weapon in the hands of a being who controlled the mighty body of a nightmare creature. After all, it was the skill and intellect that gave the weak humans a chance in battles against the abominable vessels of corruption. And more harrowing still, was the fact that the flesh of many puppets cut by the swords simply mended itself, erasing most of the damage. They were not living beings, after all. And since the queen could control her puppets intricately enough to make them rot or restore themselves from being rotten, she could erase these cuts, as well. As the heat, the light, and the weakened shockwaves reached the two armies, the soldiers backed away, horrified by the cataclysmic collision. The colossal skull watched silently, though, having witnessed far more dreadful battles. Chapter 2213 The soldiers watched the battle between the sovereigns in stunned, breathless silence. To them, it looked apocalyptic. The sea of the dead and the celestial river of rustling swords had intertwined into a vast storm of devastation, with mangled pieces of severed flesh and shards of shattered metal obscuring the battlefield like a chilling haze. The bone plain continued to tremble as if from a powerful earthquake, the violent tremors throwing countless soldiers to the ground. The cacophony of the unfathomable battle was overwhelming and deafening, and the winds it had given birth to were strong enough to make the awakened warriors stagger and sway. It seemed as if the sky itself would break apart and fall, or rather, overflow with incandescent radiance, countless rays of incinerating sunlight pouring through the breaches in the cloud to annihilate the cowering armies. However, the cloud veil still held, perhaps because the sovereigns had chosen to preserve it, perhaps because Saint Tyrus of White Feather still struggled to maintain it. The sovereigns themselves were like two tiny specks in the vast, calamitous carnage of the world-ending confrontation. And yet, it was impossible to miss them even in the mayhem. Wherever the two collided, the storm of swords was torn apart, and the sea of puppets receded, leaving countless pulverized corpses in its wake. Kisong and Anvil fought on the ground, and they fought in the air. The power of their blows was so devastating that air itself was displaced and burned away, creating vast pockets of vacuum above the quaking battlefield. The wind rushed to fill the void, causing hurricane gales and furious twisters to move across the surface of the ancient bone, and deafening thunderclaps rolling above it. Few were able to discern the details of the royal battle, but those who could saw Anvil defending himself with his 7 dreadful swords as Kisong attacked with her bare hands like a fierce beast. Her movements were so fast that it seemed as if she simply disappeared from one spot to appear in another, sometimes nearby, sometimes hundreds of meters away. The king was like a statue of black steel, his fluttering cloak and the plume of his helmet framing it with brushes of vibrant vermilion. The queen was like a beautiful goddess of blood, her regal dress flowing like a vivid red stream in the shadow cast by the myriad of flying swords. 2 great wings tore through the porcelain skin of her back, spreading open as drops of crimson blood fell from the black feathers. Anvil's armor bent and rippled as Kisong's nails pushed and cut into the mystical metal. However, it repaired itself as swiftly as it was damaged, remaining immaculate and pristine, for now, at least, the queen had not been able to make the king bleed. Which was why he was still alive, perhaps, considering that her dormant ability allowed Kisong to aggravate any wound. That ability had been slow, but deadly when she was a sleeper. Now that she was supreme, the smallest scratch received in her presence could very well mean instant death. That was why Anvil chose a steady and methodical sword technique, concentrating on defense while manipulating the indestructible metal of his enchanted heavy armor to maintain its flawless integrity. However, even though he was mostly defending himself against the queens, each of them seemingly devastating enough to erase entire settlements off the map, that was not all Anvil did. His 6 dreadful swords were moving around him, creating a rustling sphere of metal. The 7th, the most terrifying of them all, rested solidly in his hand. The cursed blade parried and deflected Qi Song's blows, shooting forward from time to time to pierce her flesh. The queen seemed wary of the cursed sword, however, she did not put too much effort into avoiding its touch. Time and time again, Anvil's sword cut her. The ruthless blade tore through Qi Song savagely, dealing her harrowing wounds. Or rather, it should have. Strangely enough, though, no wounds was left on the queen's body when the sword retreated after delivering her a fatal blow. It was as if she was a ghost made of water, or maybe blood, and the gray steel simply passed through her without leaving a trace. If one was very attentive, however, and possessed the inhuman ability to parse through the calamitous chaos of the great battle with their mind, taking all of it in at the same time, they would have noticed a curious detail. Every time Qi Song received a lethal wound and ignored it without as much as a wince, one of her puppets far below fell to the ground, its body gruesomely severed. Anvil did not seem surprised by what was happening at all. Deflecting another attack and pushing Qi Song's hand away, he sent one of the 6 flying swords barreling forward. The queen was a split second too late to react, and the cold steel passed through her slender neck. She should have been beheaded, but instead, there was not even a mark left on her skin. Her other arm shot forward, striking Anvil in the chest. The world shuddered from the dire power of her blow, and the obliterating shockwave rolled upward, threatening to disrupt the veil of radiant clouds. The king sneered behind the dark steel of his helmet. This is going to be tedious. He mended his armor a moment after it was almost torn by Qi Song's hand, then raised his own, grabbing the second of the 7 terrifying swords from the air. Wielding 2 blades now, Anvil effortlessly switched from his defensive battle art to a reckless, aggressive style that abandoned caution in favor of an overwhelming offensive might. His black figure exploded forward, flying across the sky with dreadful speed. The 2 of them collided high above the battlefield, raising a hurricane with the sheer dreadful force of the thunderous impact. How many of these puppets do you have now? Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. Well, it doesn't matter. I'll kill you 100,000 times if that is what it takes. Qi Song laughed. I wish I could enjoy killing you 100,000 times, as well. With that, she pushed one of the swords away, battered another one to the side with her fist, and grappled Anvil in the air. Her raven wings pushed against the blinding sky, and then, both of them plummeted from the height, falling toward the bone plane. Qi Song rammed Anvil into the ground with harrowing force, making the entire plane shudder. A powerful quake threw thousands of soldiers off their feet, and the ancient bone fractured, thousands of sharp shards flying in all directions like a vast cloud of spreading shrapnel. Standing among the soldiers of the sword domain, the Lord of Shadows looked down and stared at one of the bone shards rolling to his feet. His fearsome mask remained expressionless. Crazy bastards. They are actually breaking the bone. 2214. The soldiers of the 2 great armies were cowering in front of the startling fury of the clash between the 2 demigods, their faces pale, their eyes opened wide in awe and terror. Sunny was not feeling too brave at the moment, himself. Leaning on the hilt of his odachi while the tip of its blade rested on the ground, he was observing the battle intently. His black mask remained expressionless, but the man behind it had a grim expression on his face. The soldiers were merely witnessing the clash, after all. They were frightened by the obliterating forces that the 2 sovereigns were unleashing, but what they feared was becoming collateral damage in the dreadful fight, at most. Sunny, however, would soon be facing these monsters in battle himself. He would experience the indescribable terror of their inhuman power himself. So, his wariness was far less theoretical. Too strong, too fast. The sovereigns were indeed far beyond any saint. Even Sunny, who was a transcendent titan, was not anywhere near their level of strength. He was struggling to follow their movements with his eyes, and any one of the countless harrowing blows they rained upon each other would have left his body broken and mangled. Their power was simply tyrannical. However, in and of itself, it was not too terrible. He had faced and killed plenty of great nightmare creatures, after all, to the point that fighting them ceased to feel like the stuff of dark and dreadful legends. Many of them had been faster and stronger than Qi Song and Anvil were, capable of toppling mountains and reshaping landscapes with their blows. They had died under his blade nonetheless. There was a different plane to the battle between the sovereigns, though, one that few could perceive. Sunny could not perceive it, either, but he knew that it was happening out there, in the vast storm of rustling swords, reshaping reality itself. Just as the king and the queen were engaged in a physical battle, their wills were battling each other, as well. Perhaps Anvil's impossibly durable armor was only remaining whole because he willed it to be. Because Qi Song's bare hands could bend and break the armor because she wanted them to. The sea of puppets and the hurricane of swords were merely extensions of their mortal bodies, as well. They were expressions of their dire power. Every time a flying sword pierced a dead puppet, and each time dead hands closed around the cold steel of a flying sword, the two wills clashed with each other, too. He was not knowledgeable enough about the will, but he was sure that the sovereigns were wielding it with just as much skill as they would any weapon. And just like a weapon, the will was a deadly tool in their hands. Perhaps the real battle was happening on that conceptual plane, unseen by all except the two supremes themselves. There was another level to their clash, as well, one that made Sunny's head ache. It was the clash between the domains of the two sovereigns, which had some effect both on how much strength they could express, and how sharp their will could become. Perhaps, he was not sure, Qi Song had decided to have the battle on the breastbone reach, which was a strange choice. Here was the territory of the King of Swords. After all, she was surrounded by his domain from all sides, which had to be a great disadvantage, stifling her power. However, just before they clashed, everything changed. Sunny could not quite perceive it, but he did sense it, a subtle shift in the very nature of the world around them. It must have happened because somewhere far below, Revel finally conquered the Spine Ocean Citadel, Qi Song gained more authority over Godgrave, and the boundary of her own land pushed against Anvil's sphere of influence from the depths of the Dark Ocean. And then there was the Dream Gate, which seemed to have opened to the snowy vista of Ravenheart, somehow. Sunny knew that the Dream Gates served as conduits of supreme power. Whenever they appeared, the surrounding land became a part of the sovereign's domain. That was how Anvil and Qi Song were able to bring their domains to the waking world during the Chain of Nightmares and eliminate the Gate Guardians that had emerged during the Battle of the Black Skull. Ravenheart was now directly connected to Godgrave, spreading the Queen's influence to this godforsaken land, most likely. So, a fragile equilibrium was formed, with the two sovereigns fighting on the boundary where their domains pushed against each other, creating neutral ground. Sunny had to keep all that in mind. He had to watch, and wait, and when both of the sovereigns exhausted their powers, he would have to enter the fray and face their chilling, tyrannical power himself. Side by side with Nephi's, of course. Would they really be able to win? Well, now, they had no choice. Because they had already made it. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of that choice pressing down on him like a crushing burden. For a moment, Sunny allowed himself to be weak and unsure. He felt sick. He felt disgusted with himself. I am the most hypocritical person in the world, aren't I? Two worlds, even. That was because the moment Nephis had chosen the path of no return, leaving herself no other option but to defeat the sovereigns and become one herself. She had made a choice for the countless mundane humans living in the sword and song domains, as well. And Sunny was her willing accomplice. Should they fail, millions of people would die. Opening his eyes, Sunny looked at the unfathomable carnage of the great battle in front of him. The scale of it let him reel. I can't fail, then. I simply can't. He gritted his teeth. Just as always, Weaver's mask betrayed no emotion. But the shadows throughout the sword army suddenly grew deeper and colder. Endlessly deep, and infinitely cold. A tide of enchantments washed over Qi Song, pressing her into the shattered surface of the broken bone. Her wings broke with a revolting crunch, the black feathers becoming soaked with blood. Her red dress rustled, the rich fabric tearing under the immense weight. The frayed threads moved as if possessing a life of their own, however, repairing the tears a moment later. The wings were mended, as well, only to be broken once again, and mend themselves once more. Using that brief lull in the onslaught of attacks, Anvil rushed forward with impossible speed. His twin swords fell like the blades of a guillotine, one aimed at her neck, the other at her abdomen. This time, there was something different about the way the sharp steel hissed as it cut the air, as if the swords were not simply cutting space, but slicing the fabric of reality itself apart. Qi looked up fiercely just before the two blades fell on her kneeling figure. Instead of seeking to avoid them, she shot forward. A cloud of bone shards exploded backward from under her foot, and as a blinding flash drowned the battlefield for a moment, she collided with Anvil at a dreadful speed. The force of the impact made the world tremble. Anvil retracted his swords at the last possible moment, leaving two deep cuts on Qi arms. Before blocking her palm with the crossed blades, a hurricane rose, cleaving the storm of rustling swords apart, and the devastating shockwave sent thousands of puppets flying. This time, however, no puppet received the wound for the puppet master. The cuts remained on the queen's porcelain skin, swelling with crimson blood. As Anvil slid dozens of meters back, and she rushed forward to pursue, a vicious smile twisted her lips. A will sharp enough to cut the world. A moment later, her delicate hands descended upon the king like a crushing tide. A litany of deafening thunderclaps consumed the battlefield, fusing into a continuous roar. Qi graceful figure seemed to blink in and out of existence as she moved around Anvil, delivering 100 devastating blows from all directions in less than a second. The bone plane quaked, a soul vast enough to encompass the heavens. With a snarl, she delivered one last blow, the most dreadful of them yet. 5 of Anvil's swords were batted away, and he blocked her soft palm with the last 2 blades. The impact was so terrible that a furious explosion blossomed from the point where her skin touched the cold steel, washing the world in light and flame. Anvil withstood the attack calmly, but a deep crack spread through the ancient bone from beneath his feet, cutting it like an ugly scar. Qi laughed as she danced away from his retaliation, her red dress flowing behind her like a stream of blood. A heart cold enough to extinguish the flames of hell. As he lost his balance and fell, she lunged forward with a wicked smile. "Aren't you a marvel to behold, Vale?" Scattering the 5 swords with a powerful wave of her mighty black wings, she mounted Anvil like a beast, raised her hands, and clenched them into fists. A monarch among monarchs. The first of the obliterating blows fell down upon him, causing more thunder, more light, more heat. The blades of the swords Anvil used to protect himself were already glowing red. Somewhere else on the battlefield, the dead titans were standing like tall mountains in the storm of flying swords. The lesser puppets were shredded and cut down, but these colossal abominations were too vast, too dreadful, and too powerful to be destroyed easily. They walked across the bone plain, converging slowly on the spot where the 2 sovereigns were locked in a deadly brawl, and the world itself shook under their footsteps. The storm of swords raged, aiming to bar their path and destroy them. Each of the gargantuan abominations was surrounded by a great maelstrom of rustling steel, countless sharp blades shredding their flesh in a vain attempt to bring the giants down. However, the body of a titan, even a dead one, was as resilient as it was colossal. Some were covered by unbreakable armor, some by thick layers of impossibly tough hide. Some were like crawling mountains of misshapen flesh, all damage dealt to it healing in a matter of moments. Despite the harrowing force the flying swords unleashed, the titans did not fell, and neither did they stop. Up to a point. The hurricane of swords suddenly twisted, the myriad of blades forming countless runes around the marching giants. Then, the runes ignited with an ominous scarlet glow, and streams of ethereal red light connected them like rivers. The scarlet rivers formed nets that surrounded the titans, or cages, perhaps. The bars of the sorceress cages were intangible, and yet, the gargantuan abomination crashed into them as if they were made from solid metal. The bone plane shuddered as the dead giants collided against the rays of scarlet light, staggered, and came to a halt. Some distance away, Anvil was still unharmed under the barrage of Qi fierce attacks. Even though the surface of the ancient bone around them was riddled with cracks, his dark armor remained intact, and his body remained unbroken. Laying on the ground, he sneered coldly. I am. A moment later, 5 of the 7 dreadful swords pierced Qi body from behind, while the 6th pierced her heart. Anvil released its hilt, wrapped his fingers around her neck, and shot into the sky, dragging her with him. A marvel to behold, a monarch among monarchs, and so much more. As they soared high enough to almost touch the cloud veil, he turned the visor of his helmet to Qi and said with a hint of indifference in his cold, ruthless voice. "What are you?" With that, he strained his muscles and tossed Qi down. She plummeted through the hurricane of swords like a crimson comet, being pierced and cut. A moment later, the strike of the seventh sword, the cursed sword, caught up with her, tearing the hurricane apart. Qi impacted the ground with a force so terrible that the shockwave produced by her fall not only tossed the surrounding puppets down, but actually ripped them to pieces. Those closest to her were pulverized into clouds of crimson haze, while those further away were merely torn into tiny pieces of flesh. A vast net of cracks snaked through the surface of the ancient bone, surrounding her like a dark spiderweb. At the heart of that web, Qi struggled to stand up. The 6 swords, however, were still lodged in her body, impaling her and keeping her bent to the ground. Anvil landed a few steps away and walked toward her, raising the 7th sword. His voice echoed from behind the black steel of his helmet. You are nothing. Qi let out a raspy chuckle. Aren't you the kind of man to fear nothing, though? Before the cursed sword could fall, the enchanting figure of the queen seemed to blur as she assumed her transcendent form. A moment later, a great flood of crimson blood rushed forward, escaping the cage of 6 terrifying swords and threatening to consume Anvil. 2216 Crimson River. The tide of blood Qi had turned into was vast enough to fill a sea, rushing forward like a crimson flood. The glistening red river moved above the ground, twisting in the air like a living creature. The flowing wave of it rose high above the battlefield, instantly dwarfing the stalwart figure of the King of Swords. It seemed impossible that so much blood had been contained within the small and fragile vessel of a human body, and yet, reality was undeniable. Anvil had met Qi devastating blows without flinching, but he seemed reluctant to allow the crimson tide to touch him. As soon as Qi assumed her transcendent form, scarlet runes ignited on his black armor, and he used his powers to levitate back, instantly creating distance between them. The blood river breached that distance in the blink of an eye, though, covering hundreds of meters in a split second. Anvil continued to retreat, using his 7 blades to create a shimmering sphere of steel around him. As he soared into the sky and the crimson wave pursued, it swallowed countless flying swords. Moments later, the swords dissolved within it, breaking down into streams of scarlet sparks. The sparks were then absorbed by the glistening blood, leaving no trace behind. From a distance, it looked as if a glistening crimson ribbon was dancing fluidly in the air, gliding through the storm of swords. It was just that the immense scale of that ribbon was hard to fathom. Its surface shone with a beautiful red glow when the sunlight fell on it, and anyone who saw that glow felt their own blood start to boil. Sunny felt it, as well. Blood weave seemed to respond to the presence of the queen, rushing through his veins at greater speed than before. His heartbeat accelerated. They're going to obliterate the entire plane. The Titans were still struggling to free themselves of the sorceress cages. The fury of their devastating struggle made the battlefield quake, and the surface of the ancient bone was slowly chipping under their feet, for those of the dead giants who had feet, of course. The clash between the sovereigns themselves was even more tyrannical. As Anvil escaped the glistening river of blood, unleashing 1,000 enchantments to harm it, he plummeted to the ground several times, only turning to fly along the surface at the last possible moment. Qi seemed less agile in the immensity of her destructive transcendent form, though, so she couldn't turn quite as sharply. Instead, the flood of blood simply crashed into ancient bone with the force of a devastating tsunami, if that tsunami was brimming with supreme soul essence, wielded the will, and consisted entirely of blood that belonged to a descendant of Beast God, who was the god of blood, as well. Each time, the crimson tide drowned a portion of the battlefield and then reformed itself, leaving the battlefield broken. A deep, reverberating groan resounded from somewhere deep underground, and Sunny saw a crack snake across the surface of the ancient bone. It almost reached the point where the 7th Royal Legion was positioned, the soldiers paralyzed by shock and awe of the deific battle. Many of them were already sprawled on the ground, unable to keep their balance in the middle of the violent earthquake, but Rain was still standing. Sunny, who hid in her shadow, was far more powerful than any of the Song soldiers. However, even he was stunned by the harrowing violence the sovereigns had unleashed to kill each other. And they were only starting. Too powerful. Ny, Su, Sunny. The voice was almost too weak to hear, but he did. It resounded inside his head, muffled and distant, but still undeniably familiar. He stirred. Sunny stirred. Cassie, can you speak again? There was a long pause, and then, her voice came to him again. The queen seems to be distracted a little. So, her grasp has grown a little loose. I still can't reach anyone else but you, close. Sunny was indeed close to Cassie. This incarnation of his was, at least, no more than 100 meters away from the spot where she stood side by side with Sation. So, it was easy to understand why she could reach him with her powers but not anyone else. He had so many questions, and not enough time to ask them all. So, he asked the most important question first. Are you all right? Cassie remained silent for a few moments. Eventually, though, the deafening burden of her silence was broken. Fine. Sunny let out a relieved sigh. Her voice grew a little louder, as if she was straining to make herself heard. Listen, important. The queen's ascended ability, transference. She can transfer any harm dealt to her body to one of the other puppets, untethered from it. Every puppet she controls can become her primary vessel. He froze. Not too far away, the Lord of Shadows sighed and looked around subtly. The warriors of the Sword Army were all clutching the ground, and his was the only figure that remained standing in that section of the battle formation, still leaning lazily on his black odachi as his white hair fluttered in the fierce wind. That's pretty terrible news. How are we supposed to kill her, then? I am sure she has countless puppets squirreled away in every corner of the world. His thoughts turned somber. The fact that Ki-song could transfer damage to her puppets was already bad enough. However, the fact that she could not be killed until all her puppets were destroyed was much worse. Even if they somehow managed to obliterate every puppet present on the battlefield and cut down the queen herself, she would still continue to exist somewhere else. He started to consider the consequences of Ki-song remaining alive after the battle. If they managed to attain supremacy, killed Anvil, and devastated her army of puppets, well, getting rid of her for good would still be possible. It would just take a lot of time and effort. The sword domain would fall into Nef's hands. They would be poised to take control of most citadels in the Song domain, as well. Not all was lost. His thoughts were interrupted by Cassie's voice. There, still, a way to kill her. Sunny remained silent for a few moments. Her flaw. As if reading his thoughts, Cassie spoke again. She cares about her daughter. Ki-song can escape, but they won't be able to. We can exploit the weakness. Sunny sighed. It made a vile, morbid kind of sense. So, Cassie wanted to force the queen to fight until the end to save her daughters. It was a dirty strategy, no doubt. But it could work. At least if Cassie was correct and Ki-song's affection for her daughters was stronger than her desire to survive. He cautiously extended his shadow sense toward Sation, considering her graceful figure for a moment. All right, I will inform Nefis. The moment they would have to act was swiftly approaching. He hoped that they would win. He hoped that the others had done their part, as well. Something else. Cassie's distant voice sounded strangely reserved. It is about Broken Sword. The real reason he had to die. Sunny listened intently, waiting for her to continue. When she did, time seemed to stop for a moment. That was definitely not what Sunny had ever expected to hear. Reaching to him with her power, Cassie said. It was because of Weaver. 2217. Sunny froze for a moment, startled by an entirely unexpected statement. Weaver. That sinister demon. What could a dead demon have to do with Broken Sword's murder? As the bone plane groaned and quaked under the calamitous onslaught of supreme power, he lingered for a moment, then asked incredulously. What the hell do you mean, because of Weaver? Cassie responded a few heartbeats later, her voice sounding louder. The queen, it seemed, was growing more distracted, allowing the blind seer to express her powers better. Broken Sword was inconsolable. After Smile of Heaven perished. He convinced himself that she was still alive, lost somewhere in a nightmare. He grew obsessed with challenging the seed that had spawned the Category 5 gate in America, and to do that, he had to accumulate power, great power, as much power as he could. Sunny frowned, digesting what he heard. The truth of Broken Sword's later years was startling enough. But what did Weaver have to do with any of it? Cassie paused for a moment, then added. The members of his cohort were all special. Smile of Heaven, Anvil, Ki-song, Astarion, they all possessed a divine lineage. But he did not. So, he ventured to do what Ki-song had done and find a lineage memory of his own. The only lineage that was still unclaimed, the lineage of Shadow God. Sunny stirred in Rain's shadow. Far away, the Lord of Shadows tilted his head a little. Even Master Sunless blinked a few times, allowing surprise to show itself on his face. Opening square bracket ... Shadow God's lineage. Cassie's voice resounded in his head a moment later. Yes. He searched far and wide, but he failed to discover the traces of Shadow. Instead, he found something else. A piece of a forbidden lineage left behind in secret by one of the demons. Something that should not even exist, but apparently does, or did back then, at least. Broken Sword claimed that lineage, inheriting some part of Weaver, the demon of fate. Sunny forgot to breathe. What? If he had been stunned before, he felt shocked now. It was as if someone had struck him in the head. Broken Sword, found, one of the weaves. And Cassie had waited so long to tell him. Wait. Cassie's dormant ability only saw Sunny as a void. She could not remember anything she had known about him in the past, either, so, she probably did not even know that Sunny himself had Weaver's blood running in his veins. No one did. Cassie wouldn't have known the importance of that knowledge. Wait, Broken Sword had a part of Weaver's lineage. Feeling rattled and confused, Sunny took a deep breath. Opening square bracket ... Weaver's lineage, I see. Why is that important? Cassie remained silent for a few moments, then answered quietly. I am not entirely sure, but it was the fact that he had come to possess the forbidden lineage that convinced Anvil, Astarion, and Ki Song to betray him. There were plenty of other reasons, too, but this one was the decisive one, as well as the one that seemed to have forced their hand. For some reason, those of divine lineages could not tolerate Broken Sword's existence after he became Weaver's heir. And so, they killed him. Sunny shivered. This was a disconcerting piece of news to learn. Wasn't he much more of an heir to Weaver than Broken Sword had been? He had not one, but 3 parts of Weaver's lineage by now. Would those who had inherited the lineage of the gods target him for some unknown reason one day, as well? Sunny inhaled deeply. Suddenly, he was overcome by an ominous feeling. It was not a premonition, exactly, since his intuition had lost its mystical edge when his connection to fate was severed. However, Sunny had enough experience and knowledge by now to develop a 6th sense of his own. Learning that the sovereigns had turned on Broken Sword because of Weaver's lineage was definitely sounding alarms in his head. Damn great. Sunny wanted to ask another question, but at that moment, a deafening crack washed over the Song army, and the Sword army, as well. The ground shuddered once more, this time more violently than it had ever done before. Rain finally lost her balance and fell, hitting the ground with a startled yelp. On the opposite side of the battlefield, the Lord of Shadows grunted and swayed, finally straightening and raising his odachi to put it on his shoulder. The soldiers around him were all on the ground, looking around in dazed confusion. Slowly, their features were twisted by fear. His cold voice escaped from behind Weaver's mask, full of aloof indifference. Don't fret. There's nothing to worry about. In front of the 2 cowering armies. The harrowing battle between the 2 sovereigns had entered a new, utterly inconceivable stage. The forces unleashed by their confrontation were so dire that the breastbone of the dead god itself was struggling to withstand them. New cracks formed on the surface of the bone plane, and the cracks that had been there before deepened. And then, after an especially calamitous blow, the cracks began to widen and grow uncontrollably, as if a point of no return had been passed. The initial noise of the battlefield breaking had been drowned out by the thunderous roar of the impact, but now, everyone could both hear and sense the ground below them shifting. The crack that was near the 7th Royal Legion extended in an instant, cutting all the way to the edge of the breastbone reach. It widened, too, and a few unfortunate soldiers plummeted down into the darkness. Damnation. Most people could not feel it, but Sunny could. His shadow sense extended far and wide, as well as penetrating deep. More importantly, he had an aerial view of the battlefield from the Ivory Island. Therefore, he could see the spider web of deep cracks spreading across the entire plain, stretching all the way down to the hollows. As Rain rolled and rose to one knee, looking at the dark fissure of the jagged crack, she saw a thick, scarlet vine rise from the darkness and attach itself to the splintered bone. Chapter 2218. The calamitous battle between the 2 supremes had stunned the 2 great armies gathered on the surface of the dead god's breastbone. The soldiers were stunned, the soldiers were awed, the soldiers were terrified. However, they weren't the only ones affected by the cataclysmic tyranny of the deific confrontation. Deep below them, in the dim twilight of the hollows, the ancient jungle was in turmoil as well. The nightmare creatures dwelling in the darkness stirred, disturbed by the inconceivable fury of the clash between the two sovereigns. The aftershocks of the battle had reached even the hollows, sending the abominations into a frenzy. The jungle itself seemed to have come alive, as if sensing a threat. Or a feast, perhaps. Knowing that he would have to face the sovereigns himself, Sunny had been watching them fight intently. However, his shadow sense reached far and wide. He paid attention to what was happening in the hollows, as well. So, he was quite possibly the only person on the bone plane who knew what was happening in the hollows at the moment. That was the reason he was one of the first to understand what the sovereigns had done. Crazy bastards. The king and the queen actually managed to break the bone plane. Perhaps he should not have been surprised, knowing that Anvil had already cut a fissure in the dome of the hollows once, but back then, during the fight against condemnation, it had been the result of a conscious action that demanded a great amount of effort, preparation, and a grand act of sorcery. This time, the dead god's bone was broken simply from the strain of serving as a battlefield for the two murderous supremes. And the damage wasn't contained to a minor fissure, either. Instead, a net of countless cracks snaked across the northern end of the titanic breastbone, making it look like shattered glass. And all these cracks led to the hollows, which boiled with frenzied activity. The ancient jungle of Godgrave had been starved of sunlight as of late. The human armies had banished it beneath the surface and kept burning the crawling vines, thus breaking the cycle that allowed the abominable ecosystem of the hollows to thrive. Without the scarlet infestation spreading to the surface, the ancient jungle was denied the nutrients it needed to sustain itself. The consequences were not showing, yet, but they would turn grave before too long. The jungle starved, and therefore, the dreadful abominations dwelling under its canopy were starving as well. That was why the jungle, and the abominations too, rushed to the surface when countless cracks split the dome of the hollows open. Damn it! Get up! Prepare for battle! Sunny's hiss sent Rain scrambling to get up. All around her, the warriors of the 7th Royal Legion were trying to stand despite the quaking ground too. Sation's voice broke through the cacophony of the apocalyptic battle. Formation. Face the cracks. Fire. But it was already too late. The single vine that had extended from the crack a few moments ago had already turned into 100. All across the length of the jagged fissure, the tendrils of the ancient jungle were crawling out of darkness, attaching themselves to the sun-bleached surface of the bone. And there were more than one fissure around. The tide of scarlet infestation really looked like frothing blood that swelled and spilled out of deep cuts, flowing endlessly. Of course, the vines were merely a herald of what was about to come, great bridges that the jungle had risen to connect the depths of hollows to the sunlit surface. A moment later, a hideous head rose above the edge of the nearest fissure, and a great beast pushed its massive body onto the bone plane. Rain stared at it with wide eyes, terrified, then drew her bow with a trembling hand. Of course, her arrow bounced off the dark hide of the monstrous creature without leaving even a scratch on it. Things were even worse in the formation of the Sword Army. Their enemy was located closer to the edge of the titanic breastbone, which meant that the hollows were quite shallow there. After all, the subterranean hell did not extend to the very wall of the dead god's sternum. In fact, the position of the Song army was only partially above the hollows, the rest of it standing on nothing but solid bone. The Sword army was not as lucky. Since it was positioned further south, there was nothing by the dark expanse of the abominable jungle below the warriors of the Sword domain. Therefore, they were going to face more horrors. They would also be surrounded from all sides, while the warriors of Song would be safe from rear attacks, at least. Not that it mattered. Neither side was going to escape the onslaught of the Scarlet Tide unscathed, if they could escape it at all. What do I do? As the Lord of Shadows, Sunny was in the thick of it. He could rush to help the soldiers, slaying as many nightmare creatures as he could. But he also had to wait for the perfect moment to attack the sovereigns. If he was too late, one of them would kill the other and grow infinitely more powerful. If he did not wait long enough, neither of the Supremes would have exhausted their strength, and fighting both of them would be suicidal. He could not allow himself to get distracted. Seeing as a train-sized centipede crawled out of a deep crack and loomed over a dozen awakened soldiers, the entire length of its underbelly opening to reveal one ghastly, endless maw, Sunny cursed and dove into the shadows. Emerging from them a split second later, he lashed out with his odachi. The thick red carapace of the centipede was cut cleanly, and the upper third of its monumental body was severed from the rest of the monstrous creature. The severed third fell to the ground with a deafening boom, and twisted, already scurrying to swallow its first victim. The lower two-thirds continued to emerge from the crack, seemingly unconcerned with losing the entire upper portion. Sunny wasted a split second to stare at the abomination, appalled. All around him, more nightmare creatures than he could count were climbing to the surface, many, if not most, no less dreadful than the giant centipede. His gaze turned even darker than it had been before. A drop of ichor fell from the blood of the odachi and broke against the weathered bone. Curse it all. Chapter 2219. Hell had descended upon Godgrave. A storm of rustling swords blotted out the sky, unleashing a devastating rain of slaying steel upon the sea of living corpses that flooded the blood-soaked reaches of the shattered bone plain. Grotesque figures of towering titans were straining to break the chains of sorcery that bound them, the ground quaked like a wounded beast convulsing in the throes of death, and a violent litany of deafening noises seemed to shake the very foundation of the world. Two demigods continued their mortal battle high above the fractured battlefield, observed in silence by the distant, evil omen of the dead god's skull. Far below, on the broken ground, a scarlet flood was flowing from the black cracks like bloody foam. The ancient jungle was rising from the dim twilight of the hollows, starved for light and warmth. With it, countless harrowing abominations crawled to the surface, driven into a dreadful frenzy by the fury of the great battle and the tantalizing scent of human souls. Even Sunny, who had seen a hell or two throughout his life, felt somewhat shaken by the scope and scale of the disastrous calamity, as well as by its astonishing nature. He could not even imagine what the ordinary soldiers felt. The two human armies were on the verge of being consumed by the dreadful tide of nightmare creatures. However, the veterans of the Great War were a tough tribe. They had not lost their minds to fear, even in the middle of a seemingly apocalyptic disaster. The saints had regained their composure first, moving to intercept the most dangerous of the emerging abominations while barking orders at the paralyzed masters. The masters followed the orders, mechanically at first, as if simply out of habit, then with a growing sense of purposeful determination. They rallied the awakened soldiers and joined them in defending against the chilling flood of nightmare creatures. Despite that, the death toll was heavy in those first few moments. Then, as the two armies rose to face the liberated jungle, it lessened somewhat, but it was still of no use. Sunny, whose incarnations allowed him a perfect view of what was happening on both sides of the battlefield, could see it clearly. One incarnation was among the soldiers of the Sword Army, one was among the soldiers of Song, and one was watching it all from a great height. There were too many cracks, and the nightmare creatures crawling out of them were too powerful. These weren't the surface dwellers whom the soldiers of the two great armies had faced before, during the conquest of the collarbone plain, the breastbone reach, and the ribs of the dead god, and who had already been nearly too dreadful for Awakened to fight. Instead, they were the ancient horrors of the hollows, the great and dreadful predators who had spent countless years hunting others of their ghastly kind in the eternal twilight of the scarlet jungle. Many of them were of the great rank, and therefore almost entirely impervious to the attacks of the awakened soldiers. Only the saints could face them, but there were not enough saints around. Even worse, neither of the two armies had managed to maintain their formation. The cracks had appeared too suddenly, and they cut the battle lines, breaking them. Instead of presenting a united front against the tide of powerful abominations, the soldiers were now fighting desperately in whatever formations they could assemble, surrounded from all sides by the flood of monsters. The situation seemed bleak. Despite the daunting scale of the battle and the immensity of the two great armies, the struggling clusters of human soldiers were like islands doomed to drown in the rising sea of scarlet darkness. They were resisting for now, but the writing was on the wall. If nothing changed, both armies would be consumed, disappearing without a trace. The Song army was faring a little better, at least, its position was closer to the edge of the dead god's breastbone, so there were very few nightmare creatures attacking the soldiers of Song from the rear. Seishin had realized that fact, it seemed, and was now struggling to get her army to retreat further north. The Sword Army, however, was in dire straits. Sunny had summoned Saint and Fiend, sending them to help the soldiers. After hesitating for a few moments, he manifested two more avatars of himself, so that three incarnations of the Lord of Shadows could enter battle. All of them descended upon the nightmare creatures, holding the scarlet tide back. He had to be wary of wasting essence before confronting sovereigns, but with serpent in his hands and countless abominations around, replenishing it by killing them would not be a problem. Sunny and his shadows were like heralds of death, each a devastating presence on the battlefield, but even his presence was woefully insufficient to break the tide. It was like a drop on the ocean, at least for as long as he was still holding back. Some distance away, Nephis was like a beacon of hope in the sea of hungry darkness. The core of the sword army rallied around her, the soldiers being healed by her flames while her sword reaped the lives of the most powerful nightmare creatures. However, she was in the same situation as Sunny. One of his shadows was still hiding in her own. Using the moment, he spoke to her and relayed the information shared by Cassie as quickly as he could. Then, Sunny fell silent for a moment, waiting for her to finish off a hideous abomination that resembled a rotten, walking tree with a trunk littered by countless jagged maws, or perhaps a dead beast whose body had become the host of a tree-like parasite. The white flames engulfed the ghastly creature, turning the scarlet leaves to ash, and the incandescent sword, the kinslayer, cut the trunk in half. There were already two equally horrid nightmare creatures rushing at Nephis through the flames a moment later. He spoke. "We won't last long here." She looked around the battlefield, then nodded briefly. "We must advance." Sunny lingered for a moment, then chuckled darkly. "Advance? Advance where?" Nephis lunged at the two abominations, brandishing her supreme sword. Across the battlefield, toward the edge of the plain. To reach the Song army, or at least get on solid bone. He regarded the carnage of the calamitous battlefield from the edge of the Ivory Island, remained silent for a moment, and took a deep breath. "That is, a crazy idea." Sunny rose from Neph's shadow, manifesting one more avatar. Crushing the second abomination's skull with a monstrous blow of his armored fist, he glanced at Nephis and grinned beneath the visor of his onyx helmet. It might just work. Chapter 2220 Infernal Trailblazer. Sunny smiled, but his smile was quite forced. He could not bring himself to feel the desperate kind of glee that often overwhelmed him when in situations that seemed too bleak to cope with. Luckily, his face was hidden behind the visor of the mantle's helmet, so Nephis did not see his hesitation. To her, the Lord of Shadows looked as he always did, cold, confident, and full of aloof arrogance. It was such a misplaced impulse, to look good in front of her even in the middle of a literal hell descending, and yet Sunny could not help but want to. Reaching into the shadows, he pulled a black spear out of them, and then looked back to Nephis. "I'll carve the path for the army to follow." As the words left his mouth, the shadows stirred. Then, a dreadful figure rose from them, making the soldiers shudder and flinch away. The vast shadow took the form of a tenebrous steed with wolf-like fangs and two sharp horns, its eyes burning with terrifying crimson flames. The stallion seemed to be wreathed in a ghostly, indistinct haze of moving shadows, as if surrounded by a swarm of living nightmares, his sable coat seemingly absorbing light. Just looking at the towering destrier filled the hearts of the soldiers with a cold feeling of dread, which was quite a feat, really, considering how terrified they had been already. The soldiers flinched away, but Sunny took a step toward the nightmarish steed instead. Patting him on the powerful side, he said, "Hey there, buddy. I really missed having you around." Nightmare turned the chilling gaze of his crimson eye toward Sunny, lingered for a few moments, then snorted quietly. Sunny smiled. "Hey, I've been working hard too, you know." With that, he jumped into the saddle, lowered his spear a little, and looked at Nephis from above. "You'd better follow soon." She nodded, already giving orders to the nearby officers. Nightmare rushed forward. The dreadful dark destrier moved with the speed of lightning, his adamantine hooves striking sparks from the ancient bone. He rushed through the ranks of the soldiers like a wave of darkness, then soared high into the air, reaching hundreds of meters in a single leap. A few moments later, the tenebrous steed landed nimbly outside the crumbling formation, in the middle of the mass of abominations. Bones broke beneath his hooves, and flesh was torn by his steel fangs. Splatters of blood flew in all directions, and nightmare creatures, who were not supposed to know fear, suddenly cowered in terror. No matter how dreadful and deadly the black stallion was, however, his rider was like the devil himself. His fearsome onyx armor glistened dimly, and the plume of his helmet fluttered in the wind. His dark spear moved with terrible speed, piercing bodies and severing limbs. Mangled corpses fell to the ground. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the destrier and his rider would be swallowed by the tide of abominations, but instead, the tide of abominations was broken by their furious assault. The shadows stirred around them, widening the gap, and the Lord of Shadows rode forth, leaving a trail of death and devastation in his wake. Behind him, the sword army slowly started to advance. This is useless. Rain staggered back, pulled by Fleur. A moment later, a hideous claw tore at the ground where she had been standing a moment ago, leaving deep grooves in the bone that had seemed indestructible before. The titanic skeleton had been a symbol of mystical fear for the soldiers of the Song army, and although few truly believed that it had belonged to an actual god once, many came to regard it with the same reverence. However, today, Godgrave had proven to be far more fragile than they believed it to be. The entire bone plane had been fractured by the king and the queen, and now, nightmare creatures powerful enough to leave marks on its surface were besieging the Song army. Needless to say, awakened soldiers were like ants in front of these harrowing abominations. They had always been weaker than the native inhabitants of Godgrave, and so, the Song army developed various ways of dealing with stronger opponents. Rain's own arsenal was largely aimed at debilitating the enemy through various means, and yet, today, her arrows were proving to be completely inefficient. What a blessing. She did not even have to worry about her flaw, because there was no chance in hell that she would be able to kill anything. Even though Rain did not want to admit it, she felt despair settle in her heart. Rain, snap out of it. Fleur pulled her back, and Tamar advanced, desperately trying to slow down the attacking horror. Her Zweihander plummeted down, striking the abomination, and bouncing off uselessly. The legacy girl staggered from the recoil of the powerful blow, and Rain's eyes widened when dreadful claws shot toward her body. A split second later, one of the Blood Sisters landed on the nightmare creature's back, piercing its neck with a wavy dagger. Something flashed, and Tamar was tossed back. There was a deep gash on her side, but she was alive. All around them, the Song army was slowly buckling under the tide of monsters. The nightmare creatures were already impossible to overcome, but there was also the scarlet infestation itself they had to contend against. A mass of vines, moss, and grass spilled from the deep cracks in the ancient bone, crawling across its surface like a plague. The jungle brought all kinds of deadly perils with it. Damn it. Rain had no name for the emotion she felt, but could sense something boiling deep within her soul regardless. Just then, Ray appeared out of nowhere, grabbed Tamar, and helped her stand up. The four of them did not even receive a momentary respite before another abomination lunged at them, its maw opening wide enough to swallow the entire cohort whole. This time, there was no escape. Before they were consumed, however, Rain's shadows suddenly moved and rose from the ground. A dark blade flashed in the air, and the lunging monstrosity was cleanly cut in half. She let out a relieved sigh. Sunny was here. Wait, did he just openly climb out of her shadow? Rain did not know whether to be glad or horrified. Obviously, she was happy that he was with her. But if her brother had decided to reveal himself, then the situation was truly desperate. He was also wearing a fearsome onyx armor and a closed helmet, emanating a cold and unfamiliar presence. Turning his head slightly, her brother, the Lord of Shadows, brushed across the members of her cohort with an indifferent gaze. His cold voice seemed devoid of all emotions. Huh, you three again. Haven't we met before? Tamar, Ray, and Fleur stared at him in stunned silence for a moment. They would have stared more if not for the fact that the first row of the 7th Legion was on the verge of collapsing under the onslaught of nightmare creatures. Then, however, something strange happened. The pressure on the fighters seemed to lessen slightly, and a new abomination emerged from the mass of monsters, this one even more dreadful than the rest. It was a rider on a terrifying black steed, both of them drenched in blood and surrounded by a veil of moving shadows. And behind them, Rain's eyes widened. I'm seeing things, right? Was she mistaken, or were there vermilion banners moving behind the wall of nightmare creatures? Surely, she was mistaken. The end. Your feedback is appreciated.